Participating. When you go silent, something powerful happens beneath the surface that most people never talk about. It's not loud, it's not dramatic, but it's deeply unsettling to someone whose sense of confidence was built on your attention. See, for a long time, participating, your reactions acted like a mirror. Every message you sent, every explanation you gave, every emotional response you offered reflected something back to her: importance, control, reassurance. That mirror allowed her ego to stay inflated without effort. Participating, she didn't have to question herself because your presence was constantly confirming her value. But silence removes the mirror. When you stop responding, stop chasing, stop explaining, there is suddenly nothing reflecting back. And that's when discomfort begins. Participating, not because you said something wrong, but because you said nothing at all. The attention she once took for granted is gone, and without it, the confidence that depended on that attention has nowhere to stand. Ego doesn't collapse from confrontation. Participating collapses from absence. It needs fuel, and attention is its favorite source. At first, silence is dismissed. She tells herself you'll come back, that this is temporary, that you're emotional, busy, or trying to make a point. Participating, because an inflated ego always assumes it is still in control. But as time passes and you remain unchanged, that assumption starts to crack. Questions appear where certainty once lived. Why isn't he reacting? Why isn't he chasing? Why isn't he trying to fix this? Participating, and those questions are dangerous to an ego that was never used to self-examination. Your silence forces her to confront something she never had before, the possibility that your attention was a choice, not a guarantee. And once that realization lands, participating, the dynamic shifts internally. She starts replaying past interactions, searching for signals she ignored when your presence was constant. Moments that once felt insignificant now feel heavy because they might explain why the mirror disappeared. Participating, this is where the real exposure happens. Without your reactions to lean on, she can no longer mask insecurity with confidence. The ego that felt powerful now feels restless. Not because you attacked it, but because you stopped supporting it. Participating, silence strips away the illusion that she was always in control, revealing that much of that control came from your willingness to engage. And the deeper truth is this: attention doesn't just validate feelings, it validates identity. Participating, when you withdraw it calmly and without resentment, you don't just remove comfort, you remove certainty. She's left facing herself without the reinforcement she depended on. That's why silence feels louder than words. Words can be argued with, dismissed, or twisted. Participate not, it simply exists, unchanged, unbothered. Your calm absence becomes a statement without language. It says, I don't need to prove my worth. And that unspoken message hits harder than any explanation ever could. Participating, because the moment you stop trying to be seen, your value becomes something she has to feel instead of assume. And that is why silence exposes what attention was hiding, because when the mirror disappears, the ego is finally forced to look inward. Participate. An inflated ego doesn't survive on confidence alone. It survives on reaction. It needs friction. It needs emotion pushing back against it to feel powerful. Arguments, explanations, jealousy, frustration, even anger, all of these are forms of emotional energy. Participating, and when you were giving them, even unintentionally, you were feeding something that never learned how to stand on its own. That's why silence is so destabilizing. Because silence removes the one thing ego depends on most: a response. When you stop reacting, participating, there is no emotional resistance to lean against, no tension to dominate, no feelings to provoke. And without that, the ego doesn't feel victorious, it feels invisible. That's the part most people misunderstand. Participating, ego doesn't crave admiration as much as it craves significance. It wants to feel that it can move you, affect you, pull emotions out of you. The moment it can't do that anymore, its sense of importance begins to shrink. At first, participating, the absence of reaction is confusing. She might test the silence indirectly, expecting something to surface. A message designed to trigger you, a subtle post meant to provoke curiosity, a shift in tone meant to pull emotion out of you. These are not coincidences. Participating, they're attempts to restore the emotional exchange that once gave her ego a sense of dominance. But silence doesn't take the bait. And every time it doesn't, the ego loses another layer of certainty. The more you remain unmoved, the more uncomfortable it becomes. Participating, because an ego that is used to reaction assumes it is the cause of emotion. When emotion disappears, the mind starts questioning its own impact. Am I still important? Do I still have influence? Why isn't this working anymore? Participating in those questions are deeply unsettling, especially to someone who built confidence on being able to affect you. Silence doesn't challenge the ego directly. It doesn't argue, defend, or compete. It simply refuses to participate. Participating, and that refusal is what starves it. Think about it: an argument still keeps the ego alive. Jealousy still proves attachment. Explanations still signal investment. But silence communicates neutrality. Participating is unbearable to an ego that wants to feel superior or desired. What makes this even more powerful is that silence is non-confrontational. There is nothing to attack, nothing to twist, nothing to win against. The ego has no opponent participating, and without an opponent, it has no stage. It's left alone with its own expectations and assumptions, slowly realizing that emotional power only existed because you were providing the energy to sustain it. Over time, the lack of reaction forces a recalibration. Participating, the ego starts to feel smaller, not because you diminished it, but because you stopped inflating it. You didn't take anything away, you simply stopped giving what was never owed. And in that space, clarity replaces chaos. Participating, you begin to see how much power you're handing over through emotional engagement. Silence in its pure form is emotional discipline. It's the decision to protect your energy instead of spending it on someone else's validation cycle. And once that cycle breaks, participating, the ego has nothing left to feed on. It fades not with noise, but with emptiness. Power in emotional dynamics is rarely about who speaks louder or explains more. It's about who can walk away without needing to announce it. When you go silent without anger, participating without justification, without drama, something fundamental shifts. She expected emotion. She expected resistance. She expected you to stay engaged in the same pattern that made her feel certain of her position. What she didn't expect was absence. Participating and absence is where control starts to slip. Before silence, the dynamic was predictable. She could anticipate your reactions. She knew which buttons to press, which words would pull you back in. Participating, which moments would make you explain yourself or fight to be understood. That predictability created comfort and, over time, a sense of superiority. Not because she was stronger, but because she felt secure in knowing how much you were invested. Participating, your emotional availability gave her leverage. Silence removes that leverage instantly. The moment you stop responding, the rules change. There is no longer a clear script. She doesn't know where she stands, what you're thinking, participating, or how much access she still has to you. And uncertainty is deeply uncomfortable for someone who believed they had emotional control. Your silence becomes a signal, not of weakness, but of independence. Participating, it shows that your emotional state is no longer tied to her behavior. This is where the power dynamic truly reverses. You're no longer reacting to her moods, words, or decisions. Instead, she begins reacting to your absence. Participating, she starts noticing the lack of validation, the lack of engagement, the lack of reassurance, and once she starts reacting, the balance has already shifted. The one who reacts is no longer in control. Reversal so effective is that it happens internally before it ever shows externally. You may appear calm, detached, even unchanged, but inside her mind, the shift is loud. Questions replace confidence. Assumptions dissolve. Participating, the certainty she once had about her influence begins to weaken. Why isn't he chasing? Why isn't he upset? Why isn't he trying to fix this? These questions quietly erode the position she once felt secure in. Silence also communicates something words never can. Participating, boundaries. Not boundaries spoken out of frustration, but boundaries demonstrated through behavior. It says, I decide where my energy goes. And that decision alone changes how you're perceived. You're no longer someone seeking approval or resolution. Participating, you become someone who values peace over persuasion. And here's the key difference. Silence with emotional control feels powerful, while silence with resentment feels desperate. When you're silent because you've detached, not because you're trying to punish, participating, it carries weight. It shows you're not waiting for a reaction. You're not monitoring her response. You've simply stepped out of the game. And when one person leaves the game, the other is forced to play alone. This is when respect quietly replaces dominance. Participating, not because you demanded it, but because you demonstrated self-respect. Power shifts toward the person who can remain centered without external validation. And once she senses that you're no longer emotionally dependent, participating, the dynamic can never fully return to what it was. Silence doesn't beg for power. It reveals where power always belonged. When control disappears, something uncomfortable takes its place, self-reflection. As long as you were present, responding, explaining, participating, engaging, she never had to sit with her own thoughts for too long. Your reactions gave her direction. Your emotions gave her leverage. Your attention gave her something to manage. But silence removes all of that structure. And when there is no one left to control, participating, the mind turns inward whether it wants to or not. This is where silence becomes deeply disruptive, not on the surface, but internally. Without your engagement, there is no longer a narrative she can steer. Participating, she can't frame the situation in a way that keeps her on top because there is no feedback coming from you. No confirmation, no resistance, no reassurance, just space, and space forces questions. At first, the mind looks outward for answers. Participating, she wonders what you're doing, who you're talking to, why you're not reacting the way you used to. but eventually with no information to work with, the questions shift direction. Did I misjudge him? Did I push too far? Did I assume he'd always be there? Participating. These are not comfortable thoughts, especially for someone whose confidence relied on feeling in control of the dynamic. Silence strips away the ability to manage outcomes. When you were engaged, she could predict results. If she pulled away, you'd chase. She said certain things, you'd explain. If tension appeared, you try to resolve it. That predictability allowed her to stay emotionally ahead. But silence breaks the pattern. There's no move to anticipate anymore. And without anticipation, control collapses. Parts replaces it as introspection. And introspection is dangerous to an inflated ego because it exposes contradictions. The mind starts replaying moments that were once brushed aside, times when your effort was overlooked, times when boundaries were tested. Participating, times when respect was assumed instead of earned. Without your presence to distract from these memories, they gain weight. And the most unsettling part is this silence doesn't argue against her version of events. It doesn't defend yours. It simply removes itself. Participating, that forces her to sit alone with her thoughts without an external target to project onto. She can't blame your tone, your words, or your reactions because there are none. All that's left is her interpretation. Participating in the growing awareness that control may have been an illusion supported by your willingness to stay engaged. Silence also removes the opportunity to correct the narrative in real time. When you're present, misunderstandings can be twisted, parts of the emotion can be redirected, responsibility can be shifted. But when you're gone, the story has no editor. It runs on repeat in her mind, and each replay adds clarity instead of comfort. This is why silence feels heavy. Not because it's aggressive, participating, because it's honest. It doesn't tell her what to think, it forces her to think. And thinking leads to awareness. Awareness leads to accountability. And accountability is the one place ego avoids at all costs. You didn't demand reflection. Participating, you didn't force realization. You simply stopped participating in a dynamic that allowed control to exist. And in that quiet space, the truth has room to surface. Because when there's no one left to manage, the only thing left to face is yourself. Participating, most people try to prove their value with words. They explain, justify, remind, and repeat themselves, hoping that clarity will create appreciation. But real value doesn't announce itself, and it never needs permission to exist. The moment you go silent, participating, something subtle but powerful begins to happen. Your value stops being something you argue for and becomes something that is felt through absence. When you were present and expressive, your worth was easy to overlook. Not because it wasn't real, participating, but because it was always available. Consistency without boundaries often gets mistaken for permanence. You didn't have to sit with what you brought into her life because it was constantly there. Your support, attention, emotional presence, participating, all of it blended into the background. But silence changes that instantly. When something valuable disappears without explanation, the mind starts measuring what's missing. This is where silence speaks louder than any justification ever could. Participate. You're no longer saying I matter. You're letting the absence say it for you. She doesn't miss your words. She misses the feeling of being understood, grounded, prioritized. She misses the emotional safety you provided, the energy you brought, participating the way your presence made things feel stable or exciting. And that realization doesn't come from conversation. It comes from contrast. Value that needs explaining is already on the defensive. The moment you try to convince someone of your worth, participating, you place yourself below them emotionally. Silence removes you from that position entirely. You're no longer seeking recognition or validation. You're simply choosing not to participate in a space where your value isn't naturally acknowledged. Participating in that decision alone elevates you. And here's the part most people overlook. Silence allows memory to work in your favor. When you're gone, the mind doesn't replay arguments, it replays emotions. It remembers how you made her feel during calm moments, participate during connection, during shared silence. Those feelings grow stronger in your absence because they're no longer being refreshed or diluted by daily interaction. The emotional imprint becomes clear, heavier, harder to ignore. Silence also removes negotiation. Participating. There is no back and forth where your worth can be minimized or reframed. No conversation where effort is questioned or intentions are misunderstood. You are no longer presenting evidence. You are letting the void speak, and the void is honest. Participating, it reveals what mattered only after it's gone. This is why silence is so effective when it comes from self-respect, not strategy. You're not withholding to manipulate. You're withdrawing because you understand that value isn't something you chase. Participating, it's something others recognize when they're no longer receiving it. That understanding shifts how you see yourself first and how others experience you second. Over time, the absence does what explanations never could. It forces an emotional reckoning. Participating, she feels the loss before she understands it, and by the time understanding arrives, the dynamic has already changed. You're no longer trying to be seen. Your value isn't spoken anymore. It's felt. It's participated. There's a crucial difference between silence that comes from ego and silence that comes from detachment, and most people never learn to separate the two. Silence uses punishment as loud internally. It's filled with expectation, resentment, participating, and the hope of a reaction. It waits, it watches, it counts time. But true silence doesn't wait for anything. It isn't trying to win, prove a point, or make someone feel small. It comes from the moment you emotionally let go. Detachment is not coldness. Participating, it's clarity. It's the moment you realize you no longer need to participate in a dynamic that drains your energy or lowers your self-respect. When your silence comes from that place, it carries a completely different weight. There's no tension behind it, no urgency. Participating, no emotional hook left behind, and that's why it's so powerful. An inflated ego can sense the difference immediately. It knows when silence is meant to provoke, because provocation still implies attachment. If you're silent but emotionally invested, participating, the ego still feels important. It knows you're watching, it knows you're affected, but when silence is rooted in detachment, there is nothing to grab onto. No emotional signal, no hidden message, just distance. This is where the illusion of control finally breaks. Participating, not because you challenged it, but because you stepped outside of it. You're no longer reacting, correcting, defending, or hoping to be understood. You're not trying to change your perception of you. You've accepted that you don't need to. Participating, that acceptance is what removes the ego's leverage completely. Detachment shifts the focus inward, not for her, but for you first. You stop asking why she acts a certain way, and you stop replaying conversations. You stop needing closure. And when that happens, participating, your silence becomes natural, not forced. It's no longer something you're doing. It's simply where you are. From her side, this is deeply unsettling because there's nothing to fix, nothing to negotiate, nothing to manipulate. You're not angry. Participating, you're not emotional. You're not chasing resolution. You've emotionally exited. And once someone realizes you've left the emotional space entirely, their sense of influence evaporates. This is why detachment is not revenge. Revenge still ties you to the outcome. Participating, detachment frees you from it. You're not silent to teach a lesson. You're silent because you no longer need to speak. And that quiet finality is what ego cannot tolerate, not because it hurts, but because it exposes a truth it was avoiding. Participating, that its power depended on your engagement all along. True silence doesn't announce itself. It doesn't threaten. It doesn't explain. It simply removes access. And when access is removed without bitterness, without drama, without explanation, participating, it sends one clear message: without words, your peace matters more than control. And that's where it ends, not with noise, not with victory, but with freedom.